Hello and welcome to another episode of the Housekeeper's Diary by Wendy Berry. Now in this episode we're going to tackle chapter 14 and chapter 15 and they are enthralling and I can't wait to share them with you. Now like I said in the last video, this one is quite poignant because it sort of outlines the impact that the awful arguments and tension between the then Prince Charles and Princess Diana were having on the staff and all those around them, but in particular it was starting to have a real impact on the boys and in particular Prince William. Now this chapter is called Deadly Hostilities, and indeed they were. Now I'm just going to give you a quick quote from Wendy Berry because I think it pretty much summarises what's happening. I think it's a brilliant quote. In emotional terms, 1991 was to be the cruelest year at Highgrove so far. Over Christmas, the couple had grown so full of hatred for each other that I and the other staff feared for the safety of both. And she goes on to say that she was even worried that she was, really terrified that the princess would commit suicide or may take some awful drastic step. That's indeed how bad things were. And things weren't much better for the then Prince Charles as well. Now, I get a lot of comments from people saying, that I'm being awful about Princess Diana. And you do have to realise in the context of this book that Wendy Berry, by this stage, had had enough of Diana's antics. So she is very much biased because, unfortunately, Diana didn't treat the staff very well, understandably because she was so upset and so psychologically affected and in a marriage where she felt trapped and betrayed. And she was also very much in love with James Hewitt and he was off over in Kuwait fighting. So she was terrified about something happening to him. So all this fraught emotion and tension spilled over, and often it spilled over in the direction of the staff. So, put it in context. Wendy Berry is not your most impartial observer by this stage. The sound of muffled crying came from the back stairs. It was late on a Saturday night at the beginning of 1991. Now, Wendy Berry was actually in the process of locking up and turning off the lights and going to head down to her home, which was the lodge. And she heard this crying and she didn't know whether to pay attention to it or to ignore it. She didn't want to embarrass anyone. But then she heard Charles shout from the sitting room, "For God's sake, Diana, come here and talk to me." And then she heard him push a chair back and make his way towards wherever the sounds of the sobs were. Now, meanwhile, she'd had a little peek in the back stairs and she'd seen Diana with her head on her knees, sitting on the top step, crying bitterly, her blonde hair shaking as the sobs convulsed her body. Now, that level of distress, you can't help feeling for anyone, and you can't help feeling for Prince Charles in that situation. And the embarrassment for both of them that this all has to get played out in front of staff. I mean, let's face it, when normal couples have fights, there isn't an audience usually, or hopefully not, certainly hopefully not their children as audience. "I hate you, Charles," she shrieked. "I effing hate you." Now she actually says the F word, as she darted along the staff corridor and into her room. Now at that point, Wendy Berry just didn't want to get involved. She thought, I'm just going to leave them to it. And she let herself out the back door and hightailed it down the driveway to the sanctity of the lodge. Now, she says that they were often, as staff, getting memos from the then Prince Charles private secretary and also memos from secretaries at Buckingham Palace. And she said often they were sort of insulting sort of memos because they would be reminders to turn off the lights. And she would always think, well, this was sort of sent to the wrong person, because she was always turning lights off for the then Prince Charles and Princess Diana whenever they stayed at Highgrove. But one of the more pleasant memos she describes, and I found it fascinating, and it's about all the houses that are available for rent to the staff. And I'll just read you out what the memo said. A list of Royal Mews houses, cottages and lodges still available for rent throughout the year. These lodges and flats were free to some members of staff as long as they had fulfilled a certain period of service, of course, but also to their immediate families. I didn't realise that. Friends, girlfriends, boyfriends were expected to pay a supplement of £3 per person per night. which was still really good value because that's only £21 a week, isn't it? If you want to sort of have a live-in arrangement. So, yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, really, the staff did used to have a lot of perks. I think a lot of those perks sort of got dried up. I think they're disappearing. I think more modern work practices are in place now. Now, Diana came down with the boys and she sort of made a great sort of show of rushing into Highgrove and heading straight for the television to hear the news about Kuwait. And Ken Wharf says to Wendy Berry in the kitchen, that's what it's been like all the way down. She's been insisting on hearing all the news bulletins on the radio in the car. Allied troops had gone into Kuwait and Diana was frantically concerned about her army friends David Waterhouse and principally James Hewitt, which is understandable. Now, Wendy Berry says the princess had been corresponding with Major Hewitt while he was in the Gulf, and she was understandably distraught and worried because she was still in love with him and he was in a war zone. So after she checked the news, she walked back into the kitchen to join Harry and his detective at the kitchen table with me. Everything seems to be all right, she says with relief. And then Wendy Berry, unfortunately, agreed with her and said, yes, it's been very nerve-wracking, whereupon Diana snapped at her. Nerve-wracking, snapped Diana. Wendy, it is more than nerve-wracking when you have friends out there risking their lives, and more than friends, it would seem, hence the emotional retort. Now, Wendy Berry goes on to discuss the close bond between King Constantine, the former monarch of Greece, and Charles. And in the next few weeks at Highgrove, Charles would often have him come around for lunch and they would head off for sort of boys' dinner parties together. Diana was never there. Wendy Berry got in the bad books with Prince Charles because Willie Carson, the jockey, was due to call in at Highgrove and pick up a book for the Queen Mother. And he did, and Wendy Berry handed in the book and more or less let him go on his way. And Prince Charles was most offended that she didn't ask him in for a cup of tea because he wanted to talk to him. And Wendy Berry retorted, well, I did ask him to stay, but he said he didn't have time. And there was sort of a bit of tension and edge between the then Prince Charles and Wendy Berry. And I'm sort of seeing that more and more as the book progresses. And I think it's just inevitable that the tensions are spilling over, like I said, amongst the staff and between the principals and the staff. She said it blew over fairly quickly. And when she said it blew over, she said a really interesting tidbit about Prince Andrew. Although he did not throw seriously unbalanced tantrums like Prince Andrew, he could still stamp his feet and go extremely red in the face if he didn't get his own way. So it was a dreadful winter, lots of snow, and Charles felt cooped up inside and he couldn't go off on the hunt. And William was away at boarding school, but he did have a moment where he got to come home for a brief long weekend. And Diana and the boys drove up from London and Charles flew back on a helicopter. And Wendy Berry actually describes the helicopter landing in the paddock. And I'll just read it as is and you can see what you think about it. As it landed in the paddock, both William and Harry raced down to greet him. Charles lifted both children as they jumped up to him, spinning them both around in the air despite his still sore arm. Had such a moment been captured on film in the way that Diana always managed to capture everything on film, so that's another little dig from Wendy Berry, she feels that the unfair tag of Charles being a bad father would never have gained credence. Now, a lot of the staff, that's a running theme throughout this book, that a lot of staff really did observe and feel that Charles was a very hands-on and extremely loving father. Now, she says another really interesting thing about the relationship between Charles and Prince Harry. She's saying that the father and the two sons were completely at ease with each other as they headed back towards the house, and she's saying it was a lovely sight because Tigger and Roo, the little Jack Russell Terriers, are jumping all around them and the whole family is sort of reasonably happy. And she says Charles, who adores both boys, but has a special bond with Harry, looked on approvingly as his young son proudly paraded around the house in his army uniform. Now, Harry had this little army uniform, and Charles used to give him a thrill and take him up into the helicopter and take him to visit troops and things like that, because William was doing a few, not many, but a few official engagements, and he took his role very seriously, and Prince Harry used to be left out a little bit, so Charles used to try and compensate in this way. Now, she mentions that Faye Appleby, who was Diana's former dresser that we met earlier on in the book, was actually having her twins christened, and she was also recovering from a bout of cancer. So Diana suggested that they all head down for the christening and surprise her. So a lot of her fellow former staff members and also Diana headed down and gave her the most lovely surprise. The service was at 10:30, and Faye was overwhelmed to see Diana and so many of her old friends. She looked dreadfully thin, but her boys were beautiful, and it was a very happy occasion. And Diana was in her element, fussing over the children and chatting quite naturally to all the young mothers. Now, this is when Diana is sort of observed to be charming and sweet in public, but very different in private. Now, again, this is just from a staff member's perspective. I mean, I remember that I used to really dislike a member of staff that was in the school that I used to go to. I just couldn't stand this woman. I thought she was a bully and a real bitch. But I had another friend that absolutely adored this particular teacher. And we still are mystified by that fact. The different perceptions we had of this particular person. And it came down to how she treated different people. And I genuinely believe that all the staff have different perceptions of Diana. Maria, Paul Burrell's book, really maintained a really positive view of Diana all along, because she only got sort of positive tidbits from Paul, whereas Wendy Berry is starting to see the warts and all aspects. And then, like I said in an earlier video, Ken Worf has a very favourable view of Diana. So it just depends on the relationship they had with her. So, having said all that qualification, so I don't get into trouble, I'm going to read out this little tidbit. I remember thinking at the time how well she handled the general public and how charming and sweet she could be. It was such a shame that she cannot control her behaviour in private. Her real character is, understandably, nothing like the public perception of her. I soon realised that this was Diana's fundamental and potentially tragic flaw, a difficult, calculating, manipulative core of steel, expertly hidden by a marshmallow exterior. Now, this chapter finishes off with a really confronting occurrence, and it was the fact that Prince Charles received a call on his personal line that Prince William had had an accident in school and had been hit over the head with a golf club. Now, this is fascinating because that is used time and time over again to beat Prince Charles over the head as being a bad father, because it is used by people that don't like Charles, saying that he didn't go to the hospital, he didn't accompany Diana to look after William. Now, this sort of challenges that, and I'll read you what it says. Charles ran down the hall, his face white with shock, shouting for his coat. He looked dreadful and paced up and down as he waited for his Aston Martin to be brought from the garage. I'm told it's not serious, he exclaimed to a group of us who stood waiting at the swing door, but I feel I must get down to the hospital at once. Seconds later, the prince at the wheel, the Aston Martin, roared down the gravel driveway and out onto the main road. So Prince Charles did go straight to the hospital, whereupon Prince William had the operation. He was well enough to come up to Highgrove the following weekend. So from the point of the operation, it was mainly his mother cared for him, and Prince Charles went back to work, but then he came up and spent the weekend at Highgrove with his father. He still seemed a little bit groggy and was quieter than usual. He was banned from riding in case he came off the pony and further damaged his head. Now, it was summer and the time of official staff barbecues, and Diana actually threw an extra one at Highgrove when she was up there with the boys. And William and Harry actually brought friends from school, and it was great success. It was on Saturday, July the 6th, and they were all drinking wine and eating sausages. And Diana came and had an intimate conversation with Wendy Berry, and she said that the prince wasn't mentioned. In fact, his name wasn't mentioned the whole evening. We all realised that as soon as he returned, Diana would be off back to London. That was both how they now perfected the art of keeping out of each other's way. And she said at least that arrangement worked reasonably well, and it also protected the staff from a lot of embarrassing arguments and incidents. Now we'll go straight on to the next chapter, and this is, of course, chapter 15, and it's called Children in the Crossfire, which sort of gives you an indication of what this chapter is going to be about. Now, the chapter opens with a sort of unusual little gathering, and it's actually the estranged husband of Princess Anne, Captain Mark Phillips, Princess Anne, Andrew Parker Bowles, and Prince Charles, and they're all discussing something to do with horses and hunting or polo or something. And evidently they all get on like a house on fire, and Princess Anne's laughing at things that Andrew Parker Bowles is saying, and Wendy Berry points out that it's quite an unusual little gathering because everyone was there, had some sort of unusual relationship between each other. In other words, an affair, but it didn't stop them all getting on and being quite good chums. So Mandy, Princess Anne's dresser, appears at the back door, and she's got Peter and Zara to come over for a play date. Now, Diana was supposed to take William and Harry and Peter and Zara off to see Charles playing polo, but again, she pulls out due to photographers, which is fair enough, I guess. And it was a very hot day anyway, so she decides to take all the kids down to the pool with the nanny, and this is the really funny nanny, Jessie. And so Wendy Berry decides to take Mandy off, who's Princess Anne's dresser, off for a picnic on these tandem sort of bicycles because they've got the mid of the day off. Now, I do suspect that actually Wendy Berry had decided to write a book at this point because I think she was after some good juicy gossip. So they go off for this picnic and they have a big conversation, and she says this about it. Mandy, like everybody in royal service, had heard about Charles and Diana's rows and scenes and affairs, and like us, all knew the difference between public image and personal, private reality. The one tremendous thing about Princess Anne, though, she says, halfway through a peach, is that she's, out of all of them, she's remarkably consistent. If she wakes up in a bad mood, then you know that she's not likely to hide that from any person she comes across that day. And then Mandy adds at the end of this, nothing like the saints you have to work for. And we both laughed and nodded our heads in agreement. So the staff weren't above having a good old bitch session at a picnic, it appears. So there's yet another staff barbecue by the pool. Charles is off to see Don Giovanni. And even though Diana loves opera, she wasn't invited. So they have a barbecue. And then Diana sort of starts up all this hijinks, and she makes sure the bodyguards are thrown in the pool, and then they get out of the pool and end up chasing her around the pool and throwing her in the pool. And then the boys end up in the pool, and then Wendy Berry ends up in the pool. And she says that Diana actually gets her camera and is taking all these photographs of all the people in the nice warm pool on this summer evening, and everyone's laughing, and she's encouraging everyone to laugh and carry on. She's taking all these intimate photographs. But then all of a sudden, very quickly, she says, right, it's time for William and Harry to go to bed. And it was these sudden changes of moods. It's like, right, party's off, everything, you know, it goes back to your staff, clean up the party, get the kids to bed, I've had enough. And so it was always an abrupt ending, an unexpected mood change, an unexpected ending to this party. And Wendy Berry points out that it used to leave the staff feeling like in some way they were being used. In some way they were being used to generate this image of the princess as being this happy-go-lucky, wonderful person that just had the capability of letting her hair down. Maybe, to be fair, Diana was trying to give the boys some fun. Maybe she was very conscious of all the arguments and the awful tension, and so she was sort of using the staff to lighten the mood and to give them a happy time. And maybe she just found it really hard to sustain that sort of fake happiness that she was putting on for other people's benefit. That's what I like to think anyway. So the interesting thing is, do you remember that photograph of Diana in jodhpurs and the boys and a pony and a picnic basket and all that traditional Christmas card from the whole family? And it looked very staged, you know, with the Fortnum Mason sort of hamper and everything. It looked really cringy, very 90s, very 90s. Well, that was as staged as it looked, but evidently Diana's decision to wear jodhpurs was a last-minute decision, and staff was sent up from Highgrove back up to Kensington Palace to bring the jodhpurs back. And Wendy Berry wonders whether that was a little nod to James Hewitt, just a little hello from the love of his life. And Charles was quite grumpy and just wanted to get the photo session over. Also, the same photo session, Lord Snowdon took photographs of Diana for portraits, official princess portraits. And Wendy Berry said she just looked so beautiful. She had a dusty pink sort of sparkly gown on, and she came down to show the staff in the kitchen, and she had the most immaculate makeup with her gorgeous skin. And Wendy Berry does wax lyrical just how beautiful, beautiful she looked. An interesting side note about Harry at this photography session was that Harry was happy to be placed anywhere and responded enthusiastically to Snowdon and his assistant's commands. So obviously his fear and hatred of photographers and cameras hadn't kicked in yet because, of course, his mother was alive, and poor little Harry, I think, was, you know, at his happiest at that point. William, however, appeared miserable thanks to a heavy dose of hay fever. I had no idea that Prince William suffered from hay fever. So he was really, really miserable and needed medication and everything before the photo session could go ahead. Then she says about Emma Thompson and Kenneth Branaghn's visit to Highgrove, which fascinates me because I just adore Emma Thompson. I just love her, especially in Love Actually. She just broke my heart in that. So she's chatting with Charles over an early evening drink on the terrace that day, and she says, "Gosh, how wonderful, sir. I really love your garden. Did you really plant it all yourself?" And they were going off to Bath to see a Shakespeare play. And Wendy Berry has a lot of affection for Emma Thompson. She says, a rather handsome girl who was obviously very bright and had immediately ingratiated herself with the prince. Her husband, Kenneth, was slightly more diffident than his wife, and they were put in the green room. Thank goodness they weren't put in the blue room. They're in the green room. And evidently Emma Thompson struggled with all the summer insects because Charles didn't believe in any form of insecticide. And Emma Thompson actually complained to Wendy Berry about all the insects in the green room and said, "Is there anything that could be done?" I don't blame her, do you? I'm not a huge fan of insects myself. Now, the prince and princess holidayed together in the Mediterranean. They reached some sort of compromise and holidayed on a millionaire's yacht. And Lord and Lady Romsey was actually on that yacht. I think that was depicted in The Crown fairly accurately. The paparazzi or the photographers did find them, did sort of surround the yacht with speedboats. And Diana did do the graceful dives and the bikini shots, much to the dismay of everyone else on the super yacht. So Diana brought Harry over home for many weekends, and occasionally she had James Hewitt over to stay, as well as David Waterhouse. So obviously the Kuwait thing was over because they were back at Highgrove visiting Diana. Now this is the sad, rather poignant bit. By now, William and Harry were more than conscious of their parents' problems, with poor William's face betraying a child's terrible sensitivity and awareness of how difficult things were at home. And then she goes on to say, it was obvious for the children's long-term happiness something needed to change radically, otherwise they would become emotionally scarred by the situation. Now, I'm going to describe something that's quite confronting and disturbing, okay? And we all know this, but it just really hit me when I read about it. William bore the brunt of it, often finding his mother crying in her room. Like any young child, he just desperately wanted his parents to love each other and for all the fighting to stop. And then she describes a particular incident. It's not the one pushing the tissues under the door. This is a different one. One afternoon, he found Diana crying on the back stairs and asked her what was wrong. The princess did try to compose herself, but was unable to stop her tears, saying between heart-wrenching sobs that she would explain when he was older. Suddenly, Charles appeared and asked William to go into the garden with him, and William, by this stage, close to tears himself, turned to his father and shouted, "I hate you, Papa! I hate you so much! Why do you make Mummy cry all the time?" And he ran down the stairs and into the garden, followed closely by Charles. And then Diana shouted at her husband, "Now look what you've done, Charles. Why upset the children?" Now, obviously it could be argued that she upset the children by crying so publicly. I mean, admittedly, she was crying on the back stairs, but if you're going to be heart-wrenchingly sobbing, wouldn't you take yourself off? I mean, in this vast estate, huge vast estate, if you're going to be heart-wrenchingly sobbing, take yourself off to the shower or take yourself off into the grounds where you won't be seen, away from the kids. And when William comes up, say, "Oh, it's all right, darling, Mummy just feels a little bit ill, or I'm just a little bit upset, but it's got nothing to do with you or anyone else. I'm just a little bit upset. I should take myself off and wash my face." Or, you know what I mean? Parenting, adulting. But it's understandable, William's reaction, and it's to his credit that he has managed to grow up into such a fine young man. Well, he's not that young anymore, is he? He's middle-aged. But it is to his credit. And I'm so glad that he does now have a really close relationship with his father. Now, an interesting side note is that Ken Worf was a godsend in situations like this. He knew better than most how traumatic the prince and princess's bickering was on the kids. And Wendy Berry says he would magically appear at a moment of crisis and take them well out of earshot. "Come on, William," he would shout, "let's go and have a long walk. I've got something juicy to tell you." So he was a gem. And I think you need people around like that, don't you? Now, Jessie, the nanny, this was the very forthright and plain-speaking Cockney nanny, used to get driven mad by Aunt Diana because Diana would freeze members of staff out for sometimes weeks at a time. And then she would suddenly decide to speak to you again, but you would have to still do your job and ask her questions, and she wouldn't even answer you. Well, Jessie didn't take this lying down, being the rather dominant Cockney nanny. She used to intentionally ask Diana question after question after question and force answers out of her. The staff Christmas lunch was arranged for Thursday, December the 19th at Cersei's restaurant in London. Now, Diana was in no mood to celebrate, understandably, because she'd just been to the funeral of Leonora Knatchbull, the daughter of Lord and Lady Romsey, who died of cancer. So that would be very, very sad. Now, Charles gave one of his most amusing, arousing speeches I've ever heard from him, with lots of in-jokes. And evidently Diana was preoccupied with a really quite awful article that was printed that day about her in the Daily Mail. And it was making out that Diana wasn't going to turn up for Rain Spencer's traditional Christmas party at Althorpe. And, Diana was quite distressed that she was being portrayed as being anti-Rain and not being very nice. Now, Wendy Berry points out that everyone knew she hated Rain Spencer, couldn't stand her. So it wasn't the fact that it wasn't true, it was just the fact that it was being printed in the paper. The following day, Charles returned to Highgrove, so this would be December the 20th. And it's interesting that the cleaners and Wendy Berry worked all morning getting the beds changed, washing the towels and bath mats, and packing up the Christmas tree 5 days before Christmas, because, of course, the royals go off to celebrate Christmas is Sandringham and they weren't due back at Highgrove until mid-January. So all the staff packed up all the Christmas decorations, the Christmas tree, everything Christmassy. And one of the cleaners says, isn't it bad luck to pack up Christmas before Christmas has ever happened? And they all said to her, well, if you want to come back on your own on Boxing Day and pack it all up by yourself, you're very welcome to do so. But they all wanted to spend Christmas with their families in their homes, so hence getting it done early. And then she finishes off this chapter saying, no matter how bad the problems of 1991, there were nothing compared with the events of 1992. 1992, of course, was the year of the separation. And I'll tell you the title of the next chapter, chapter 16, The Row About the Mercedes. And I'll be back with that very, very soon. Thanks for joining me. Bye.